Well, I tell you, it's insane. If you folks know how I started, you know it's all on TikTok during quarantine 2020. So if you've seen my videos, one, I'm sorry. And two, you'll know that I've stuck to the same format over and over. Every recipe begins with X and Y from 19 Z and B. It's not how the alphabet works, but all of that is done inside and indoors, and I talk to my phone alone in my kitchen, and I've got Frank, my sago palm, and we're just chilling. And that happened for 3 years. And I did this in Wyoming. And if anyone knows anything about Wyoming, there's no one there. So I was going about my business, undisturbed, unperturbed. So imagine my surprise the first time I get on a plane to come to New York City to the publisher to celebrate the release of my first book, Baking Yesterday. And I'm in the Hudson News, and all of a sudden I hear, "Dylan? Is that you?" I said, "Well, I hope it's me. Are you talking to me?" And I was recognized in an airport. And I said, this is very bizarre. I had thought I might have stolen something inadvertently. But it was such a shock. And then to arrive in New York and to go through all of these book events and to see all of these people that I only saw previously in usernames were actually stood up in front of me. Insane. So it was wild, and I pinched myself for quite some time, so much so that I almost have a permanent bruise. So, yes, it's rather exciting, and I'm glad to be here.
We're very excited to be here. Question of American recipes. So first off, let's start with the idea of this. What inspired you to write Baking Across America?
Well, if we go back to that which I do online, right? Baking recipes from the 1900s right the way up to the 1980s, and that format remained the same. And I got the idea for Baking Across America by reading the comments, which is something you're advised not to do if you get it online. But I tell you, for these videos that I did on TikTok and continue to do, all of the comments were similar. I would hear things like, "I remember when my mother used to make this. I remember when my grandmother used to make this." Or, "I'd rather not remember when my aunt used to make this." And all of these comments, on top of things like that, they would say things like, "Oh, I didn't think that would be good," or, "Yes, of course that was good." But then, I baked a recipe for the first time that was famous in a particular place. I remember it was the gooey butter cake of St. Louis, Missouri. And the comments were very different. Everyone went feral. Instead of saying, "Yes, that which I just described," people were saying, "You have done the entire state and my ancestry of Missouri proud." Or, "This is the shining star of St. Louis." These folks were ready to go to war over a dessert. And I said, isn't that interesting? Are we now speaking about the same thing? Because this is a set of instructions to put something on the table. But you're treating this like it's like a patriotic hero. So I said, ooh, there has to be more gooey butter cakes. Wouldn't it be fun to go state to state to find the shining stars from every state? And I said, yeah, it would be great. So previously, where I had arranged all of my cookbooks on the floor, you guys ever seen crime scene investigations? And you're connecting the dots. I had laid them out by decade. And then I began to lay them out by state. And that's what started quite an intense journey.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched a little bit on, how that idea sparked. But when you were actually making this book, what was that process like? I know you went to 18 plus states and DC. And did you actually, you really traveled across the country for this book?
Yeah, we bit off more than we could chew. It's one of those things where if you knew the full scope of that which you were attempting, you would never attempt it. All that to say, you have to be a little bit crazy and not fully, not playing the full deck to try something beyond what you think you're capable of. And you say, Dylan, what are you talking about? I'll explain it to you how we did this book. So it was me, my photographer, my editor, Alexander Rigby, and my good friend, Kaylee Stoller, who's actually in the audience this evening. Because Kaylee was my right hand when it came to baking these things. Because I needed some extra help, because all of those folks that I just told you about, we would fly in separate flights, meet in the baggage claim. We would book it to the nearest grocery store and hope they had every ingredient needed for that which we were baking. And then we would go to an Airbnb, hope they had a functioning oven, and then bake them, hope they had to turn out right, and then take them onto the streets and photograph that. And what makes that difficult is for cookbooks, normally you have a studio, near infinite takes, and you have a food stylist and you have pages and these things. No, you're not melting a pie in sort of Savannah, Georgia, 90-degree heat. But we managed it. Now, that presented some difficulty. I have never been able, and I never will be able again, to burn a pie in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Do you folks know those old electric ovens that sort of look like a filing cabinet? And they have both a bottom element and a top element? Well, this one rivaled Chernobyl. It was incredible. So after making a 9-inch hockey puck, we tried again, and that was our pecan pie. And other difficulties arise when it comes to traveling with ingredients in these things, specifically 2 pounds of powdered sugar. They ask you some questions. And of course, we were headed to Yellowstone National Park, which the story wasn't adding up. You're making a cookbook in Yellowstone National Park. You need 2 pounds of powdered sugar. All right. We found some more. It was a fantastic process, but it was difficult. And if we knew that from the outset, I think we would have reduced the scope, which would have made this less special. And yes, it's got some grit. It was photographed on the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. And I have, so many great stories. And, Kaylee will account this. I remember being in Boston, Massachusetts, on School Street, imaginatively named because it's the site where the first public school was in the United States. So we were called shooting this for the Boston cream pie. We had made the Boston cream pie. I was sat down, my back was to the street, and we were slicing it, and we had the photographers ready, and we were going to take this picture on the Freedom Trail. And here comes a tour bus behind me, and it stops. And I look to my right, I said, there's no traffic there. Now these tour buses have PA systems, audible from the outside. So I'm sat here on the sidewalk with a Boston cream pie, which is a strange sight to begin with. And all I hear from this PA system is, "Beat Dylan Hollis." And is that a Boston cream pie? And I just said, yes. What else can you say? And the last thing he says, all right, folks, our next attraction is... I was an attraction that day. I really was. And that's what it was like. State to state, city to city. I had a great deal of it.
It sounds like it. And you really don't think when you're traveling like that, what's the Airbnb going to have? It's just not something you think of on a day-to-day.
No.
So it's so interesting that you arrive and you're just like, oh, well, we gotta make do.
Yes, 36 frying pans and no sponges. Airbnbs are interesting.
So we talked a bit about your process, laying out your recipes, you're going through state by state. But how did you land on what recipe would represent each state? And how did you end up deciding what specific versions you would use?
I knew picking a recipe to represent the states, I knew that was going to be more a matter of diplomacy than a matter of cookery. Because what if you pick the wrong thing? I sent my post office a bit of a letter warning them that I may receive a death threat or two should I pick the wrong thing for a steak? But those cookbooks that I had mentioned to you earlier that were now laid out on my floor make it very difficult to host guests in my house. If I took 20 of them from Georgia, for example, ranging from 1900 to 1980, and half of every one was dedicated to peaches, that's a fair indication that peaches meant something to Georgia, and thus that is a worthy recipe entry. So you go peach cobbler, you put these kinds of things, and that's what we ended up with. And then you have easier states like Florida with its key lime pie, or Massachusetts with the Boston cream pie. More difficult ones like Mississippi mud, be it a cake or a pie for the state of Mississippi. It's one of those recipes that were sort of attached to Mississippi rather than born from, because of course the river runs through more states than just Mississippi. But it's a great one, and we're proud of it. And I delegated, I set that recipe for Mississippi. Then you have things like Wyoming, which you have to do some deep dives. In Wyoming, they have fruit called a choke cherry, which is awful. It's in the name. But because there's little to do in Wyoming, you'll find the kitchens of old-time Wyomingites just filled with choke cherry jams and preserves because, you sweeten it enough, and that's the only thing you can do with the fruit. You can make jams and preserves. So the old-timey way of sweetening quick threads, cakes and muffins with jams in lieu of sugar, that was how I came up with the choke cherry homestead muffins here. So that's, it's a bit of a stretch, but that's how I came up with that. And then, of course, you can't discount the internet to bolster that which you find, and most importantly, libraries and local libraries I owe a great deal to because they upload their newspaper archives, so you log on to your credentials to a local library, and you can search by year, by city, by county, and you can see what they're talking about in that state. Letters to the editor, food columns, and you can get a great deal of your stories and information from that. And I'm thankful for that resource.
Is there anything that you wish had been included that wasn't able to fit? Or recipes that you're still wishing had made the final cut?
Yes, I can think of Maryland. The state of Maryland has a recipe called the Smith Island Cake. It's about 14 layers. I'm joking, it's only 9. Which is about 5 too many. But it's, it's a very delicate sponge cake, a very rich, creamy, fudgy filling, and if you and I started baking this right now, we could enjoy it by Christmas. So, I said, for utility's sake, let's not include that. So we included the burger cookies instead, which taste really good, but they're interesting looking. I said they have a face made for radio. But they're brilliant. And then you've got things similar in West Virginia. They have a recipe called pepperoni rolls, which are great, but then you're dealing with yeast doughs and the variability in which all of the pepperoni can bake, and if you choose the wrong pepperoni, too much fat, you're going to have a ruined recipe. So I said, we can't do that. But I did manage to put in quite an interesting recipe for the state of New York. New York, particularly New York City, you may know of the hotel called the Waldorf Astoria. I would argue it's the most important hotel in the Western world. It's birthed recipes like the Waldorf salad, if you folks know. It's one of my favorite things. Bizarre, creamy, celery, raisins, walnuts, mayonnaise. It's good. However, in the 1950s, whether by curiosity or curiosity of illicit substances, they encased things in gelatin.
Oh God, not the Jello.
So a recipe entry for New York is actually called the Waldorf on Stas, translating to Waldorf in stasis, like Walt Disney's head. A cold, clammy, jiggling reprieve, sliceable to bask in its slab-sided absurdity. And I liked it. And my publisher wondered why My psychiatrist wondered why. I really wanted to get that in there. And I remember the meeting with the publisher saying, I would like a gelatin mold in my second cookbook. And they said, Dylan, would you like a second cookbook?
I had the pleasure of seeing it in person. We were at Delish in New York, our first week, I guess right before on sale. And they had made one for Dylan, and he offered me a little bite. And it jiggled 3-4 times.
Oh yeah, kept going. In the wind, I offered you and Kristen and the publisher and everything, who were there to support me. No one ate it. I think it's really good. Well, perhaps we should move on. We're trying to celebrate what's going on.
Yes, we should. You're right. So we're in Arizona, so we obviously have to talk about the recipes from the state. So we have the piñon tart, the prickly pear cheesecake, and the Dateland iced Hollis. Tell us more about these recipes and their significance.
I shall. They're really good. And I think they're better to talk about than gelatin. Please forgive me. But when many folks think of Arizona, they think of prickly pear. However, it's one of those things, like I described to you, like the Mississippi mud has been attached to Mississippi. You won't find many of folks in Arizona daily eating prickly pear. I remember the first time I reached for one.
No.
And I realized why you don't.
Yeah.
But you go into any of the national parks, they have sort of jars. It's a touristy approach. However, it's prevalent and it happens to taste really good and it's sweet. It's just not encountered a lot. So a prickly pear cheesecake is as simple as it sounds. It's a very simple, wonderful cheesecake imbued with the flavors of prickly pear. So that was, you can say, not an easy out, but it's a celebrated flavor here, and I'm fond of it. Now the Dateland iced Hollis, man, they were my favorites. Dateland, Arizona, is anyone here familiar with? Yeah. It's a vestige now of what it once was. The Dateland Auxiliary Air Base, back in the day, planted swathes of date palms, and they were churned out by the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And a recipe from a few cookbooks from that air base, the wives of those servicemen, detailed a frosted oatmeal cookie sweetened with dates. And it's one of the most amazing cookies that I've ever had the joy of having. So I said, look, it's Dateland. People normally just pass there if they need to use the bathroom. But it's fantastic. So there's that one. And then the piñon tart, the pinyon pine. Anyone up near Flagstaff? I mean, pine nuts are my favorite. One of my favorite nuts, which is sad because they're one of the most expensive nuts. They take years to even, produce, and they have to be harvested by hand. But the flavors of the Southwest and Arizona really celebrate that. But I think they're celebrated mostly in savory cuisine. So a piñon tart is, think of it like a buttered crust and like a pecan pie on top, but with pine nuts, man. And it's good. So I'm a fan of Arizona for all three of those things.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the date palm, and I just find that history of it so fascinating, and one that I really wasn't familiar with prior to your book. And that also brings me to my favorite part of this book, which are the intros to each recipes, which provides some history and background to why these recipes have been selected. So how was that research done on your end?
That was all thanks to those libraries, man. All of that, all of those newspaper archives, all of these types of things that talked about that story that I just told you about Dateland. Before I dug in, I thought it was just a rest stop, a pit stop. I didn't even know there was an air base there once. So I was happy to have that ability to dig deep through there. So certainly newspapers is where I got a lot of them. And then I presented the wild and the wacky versions of history that I like Like the Waldorf Astoria being celebrated typically for Guy Lombardo giving his New Year's Eve broadcast from the top floor, or fancy debutante balls and these types of things. But I'd rather celebrate it for salad.
Were there any recipes in your research that were surprising or maybe controversial while that were coming up?
Yes. 1979 in St. Louis, Missouri, as the book detailed. St. Lucas United Methodist Church produced this cookbook called Cookbook. But in there, they had a recipe called a yum yum salad.
Uh-oh. I know where this is going.
If you don't know about it, you're lucky. 2 boxes of lemon jello. Okay. A 20-ounce can of crushed pineapple. All right. Half a pound of cheddar cheese. Half a cup of unmitigated white vinegar. Yes, that's where it gets premeditated. And then for this gelatin mold, they give you a choice for the last 2 ingredients. Like you're on death row, and you get to choose the method by which you're executed. They say you could either have pickles, or you could have olives. I would like to remain 6 feet above ground, so I picked pickles. And I tell you what, it's been 2 months, and I can still taste it. And that was a recipe I had researched for baking across America. You say, Dylan, why? It's a gelatin mold. They named it Yum Yum. I gave it a chance. But they were out to get me. So that was when I certainly knew I wasn't going to include, because I quite like Missouri.
Well, good thing we didn't tour there.
It's called
On the
false
contrast of
advertising.
that, do you have a favorite recipe in this book? Or at the moment, I should say.
It's a bit like picking a favorite child. One has to be ever cognizant of where they are. Say the wrong thing, off comes the head. No, there's another date recipe. It's an entry for California called the Mojave Nuggets, which are a confection, a candy made of dates ground to a pulp alongside walnuts and coconut. And they're such a sweet treat bound by honey, a little bit of almond flour. And they're, if you're into it, they're all natural, but they're still sweet as daylights. You don't have to turn on the oven in the middle of the heat. Let me tell you what, I arrived here yesterday. I'm walking across the blacktop asphalt. I lose a flip-flop. And my unadorned foot plants right on that.
No.
Where was I going to make this? Dates, yes. Anyway, all that to say, it's very hot, so you don't have to turn on your oven. This recipe. My foot still hurts, but and yeah, it's a great confection. If you've spent time in sort of Palm Springs and China Ranch Date Farm or Shields Date Garden, you'll find them by the names of like date candies or rolled dates. Stuffed dates are something different, but like these Mojave Nuggets, big fan of. Fan of the Mojave? Do you know what my second favorite desert is? The Sonora. And I should say they're tied.
Yeah, since we're here, right? Just kidding. So, we talked about the recipes inside the book. We talked about the history, the research that was done, but let's move to the outside of the book. We have somebody who fans may recognize, not you.
Oh, okay. Yes, the front of this book. Here you will see my friend Ernest. Ernest is my 1963 Cadillac. The first thing I bought when I came to the United States in 2014, thanks to my dear mother. My dear mother allowed the purchase of Ernest. I said, what is the most American thing I can drive? Turns out to be a 20-foot lead sled. And before I did any videos that had anything to do with baking or the kitchen, I would upload these videos of me and Ernest. And it was COVID was the summer of me and my car. That was, rusting, but we were having fun. So I said I would like that to be on the front of the book. Baking yesteryear, it was opposite the title page, and for this one it needed to be on the front. What you might not know is that pink there is not computer generated. The map overlay is, but that pink is actually a backdrop. It's made of paper, very similar to this right here. It's about 10 foot by 10 foot. It's a sheet of paper. And this was shot outside in Laramie, Wyoming. Again, if anyone knows anything about Laramie, Wyoming, they'll know it's very windy. And a 10 foot by 10 foot sheet of paper is the method by which sailboats gain propulsion. So I'm outside, looking into the sun, on First Street in Laramie, Wyoming, and this is flapping behind me in the wind, threatening to tear to shreds. And you'll notice on the cover, I'm not that tall. I'm sat on 2 sandbags in the seat of my car to get enough leverage out so the light can catch me for this photo shoot. And I've got a 3-layer red velvet cake that's not even in the book. I do have a 2-layer red velvet cake in there, but my editor said, you need 3 layers. I say, why? He says, well, your car is the size of Tempe. You need something a bit bigger. So while this is happening, I've got a sailboat taking off behind me. I'm on First Street in the middle of traffic. I've got this huge, cake that's craning out of the car. And just like Boston, here comes the United States Postal Service along First Street and parks right in front of me, my squinty eyes, my cake, and the camera. And he says, what you doing? Just shooting my cookbook. He says, interesting choice. Goodbye. But this is the culmination of all of that. Shot right there on First Street in Laramie, Wyoming, right outside of Laramie Laundry. Self lawnmowers. But it was good. And I think it turned out very well.
I think it did too, because from my understanding, Ernest probably couldn't travel cross country with you.
No, if we drove Ernest all around, he'd throw a rod or two. He'd protest. I could have made Baking Across America that way, but it would come out in summer of 2031.
Yeah.
You'd still be there. So, we're wrapping up this massive, production of a book, with tour included. Has there been a memory that has stood out to you most from this creation?
Golly, it's hard to pick. If we would ask Kaylee, it would be, we were in a Kansas City, Independence Avenue, a haunted mansion built in 1909 by the name of the Byers Mansion. And we're in this dimly lit parlor, back when houses had parlors. Don't know what to do there, but it's dark wood, flickering lights. And what are we doing? We're assembling a dirt cake. And the lights are flickering, and we've got it in this wonderful 1920s sort of cosmopolitan sort of cocktail glass, and we're putting the gummy worms. Dirt cake is such a strange recipe. Whenever the instruction includes insert worms into the dirt, it's a fair indication it's a strange recipe. But the dirt are Oreo crumbs and the worms are gummy worms. But yeah, we made a dirt cake in a setting that is completely the opposite of what you would expect. That was fun. Being called out as a tourist attraction in Boston was certainly a very important one. Being stopped by TSA, we had bear-proof muffins for Yellowstone National Park. We shot in the Yellowstone National Park, and when you're bringing food out there, you can't just have a wonderful buffet lined out, or else I would be arrested here. It's hard to pick one because it was such a whirlwind.
Absolutely. I mean, each region, I guess, can have its own memory associated with it. So before we open everything up to audience questions, Dylan, my last question is very open, as you may know. But are there any final thoughts that you would like to share?
I tell you, I was nervous coming here because I had never done a signing in Arizona, never done a signing in this state, and I didn't know what to expect. And I was nervous that sort of my choices for the recipes might not be representative, and I was just nervous. And I feel very grateful to have some family here, but still, I tell you what, when I came out, when I see you folks and saw your smiles and heard you clapping, I was instantly put at ease. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming out on this hot night, which seems to be a theme. And I really appreciate your hospitality. Truly. But I believe I'm going to be put on trial. I think Sequoia is going to pick some questions. If those who are curious might raise a hand if you have anything to ask. And I'll go hand.
Yes, and forgive me because I, of course, don't know people's names. So I just want to pick, and I'm just going to try my best to say your shirt color, I suppose, or whatever you're wearing. So we have a blue shirt over in the second row.
When did you realize you were going to become an internet famous?
When did I realize I was going to become an internet famous person? When people I never had seen before in my life across a gas station lot would not introduce themselves or look at me, but just face in my general direction and shout, "Eggy!" This became such a theme. Walking in the grocery store, I hadn't dressed up properly, and then, I'm on aisle 6 and I hear whispers from aisle 7, "Eggy." To the degree that it was threatening. I think that's when I realized, thank you.
Hello, my friend. Not to be parasocial, but I know you mentioned a warm welcome, so don't be taken aback by my question. My family and I are originally from New York City, and I wanted to know, in your investigations into recipes, did you find a black and white cookie recipe with lemon in it?
The black and white cookie, a genial two-tone frosted cookie. I found so many different black and white cookies. What she's referring to is, have I found a black and white recipe where it includes lemon in the frosting? Sort of, you've got chocolate on one side of this cookie and sort of an ambiguous white on the other side of this cookie. Lemon, I found, yes, quite a lot of them use that because a sort of powdered sugar icing is kind of cloying without any other sort of flavor. So quite a lot include lemon, even if it's not a primary flavor. But yes, you'll find tons of them with lemon in there, but there's many without. But the interesting thing about the black and white cookie, across all of them, is they're frosted on the wrong bloody side. The black and white cookie is frosted on its flat side, which is the opposite of when it's baked. And that's the same thing with the burger cookie in Maryland. So it's kind of interesting. Something happens on the East Coast where things go upside down. But thank you.
Yes.
Have you ever tried to bake cookies in earnest? It is so hot outside. In their cars here.
Bake any cookies in earnest. Earnest has an air cleaner atop the carburetor. And no, I've never attempted to bake any cookies in there because Earnest is without emissions equipment. So a chocolate chip cookie would be a chocolate chip and 10W40 cookie. And it might not be the safest to consume. However, I have made, heated successfully, a hot pocket in Earnest.
You with the glasses back there?
I love your books. We all do. How did you pick desserts out of all the categories in cooking?
Desserts seem to be. The question was, how did I pick desserts? Why desserts? Why not savory? Well, when it comes to cooking or dinners or the savory sphere, let's just say I keep the fire department employed. I have a liability to burn water. And I was an amateur in this space. So I said, what could I do? Where could I enter this space that I'm not going to be called out for how little I know? So I remember the first cookbook that I baked from. It was a 5 Roses Flour cookbook from 1915. And I was flipping through these pages for a recipe idea, a video idea. And I would see sponge cake, and I would see muffins, and I would see pork cake. I said, isn't this interesting? This is a fruit cake with an entire pound of ground pork in it. This is going to be something that I want to showcase and highlight. You say, what does this have to do with the question? Well, I knew I was safe to experiment and make this recipe from scratch, because who's going to tell me that I made my pork cake wrong? No one. I never heard, oh no, my granny uses, a pound and a half of pork. Oh, you used the wrong pork. No wonder your cake turned out wrong. So I was safe there by exploring the wild, the wack, and the wonderful, which only seems to crop up in baking in these old community cookbooks. It was just sort of, that's how it happened. That's how I ventured into it. But also you'll find, since I loved old things and I collected old things, it was the recipes for cookery and dinners that were never sort of written down, because that was from a time when you had housewives and these things, and they assumed that you knew how to put dinner on your table. What you needed recipes for were those special things: desserts, cakes, quick breaks. So it just so happens that the older the cookbook, the more the ratio of a whole bunch of desserts and like 1 page for dinner. So that's how I ended up. Thank you.
Yes.
Watching your shows, one of the greatest things I loved about it is how theatrical you are in. But in the process, how many times did you think that you were going to have something that, oh, this is going to be really good, and then went, oh dear God, why? But yet, also at the same time, when you thought you weren't going to get something, and you were like, wow, and I love that expression. So, how often did that happen that you were just totally blown away?
How often am I surprised, whether for good or for bad? Well, most recently on the bad side was, of course, the little church lady from St. Louis who titled her salad yum. I wanted to give her a chance, and I've had a few years shaved off my life because I gave her a chance. So I did film it, and if you want to watch it, just be prepared to gag. It's Department of Transportation, high visibility, orange. It's more. But yes, I've been very surprised before. The most surprising one I had ever baked, really, and the first one, was the tomato soup cake, which I believe I made my friends Parker and Aiden try. I brought them over and they said, "Why is this red? Is it, red velvet cake?" And I said, But the tomato soup cake it includes an entire can of condensed Campbell's tomato soup. And you say that to anyone, and they'll cock an eyebrow as to whether or not it's going to be good. But it is phenomenally good. And that was the first time where I said, okay, maybe there are the dark arts at play. These folks back in the day might have known a secret that I don't. And it's continued to be that way. So the pinto bean cake was another one. It's a cake made with anything but cake ingredients. Cans of pinto beans, peanuts, honey, eggs. It's as if someone threw a grenade down aisle 6. Completely gluten-free, yet it creates this really fluffy, moist cake that I thought was incredible. So I think I will continue to be surprised, but those are 2 that I can think of off the top of my head.
Hi, so I followed your journey for a while, and I know that you have done wonders with American cooking, but I also know you're from Bermuda.
Yeah.
And if you'll indulge us, what is your favorite Bermudan food? What hits you in that heart and reminds you of home?
What reminds me of home? My favorite Bermuda dish. You're from the island.
How could you tell?
Well, we have some of the best food. Bermuda, I say, when it comes to that which I do, which is baking, the selection is fewer. But I can think of cassava pie. Cassava pie is a dessert that I make every year with my brothers and my mom. And it's a Bermudian dish where it's a very sweet pound cake. It's made with, sodden cassava, and it's a pound of sugar, pound of eggs, pound of butter.
The best kinds.
The best kind. But the filling is salted and peppered pork, beef, and chicken. That tepid response is But I love it, and it's one of those things that when I eat it, boy, talk about a time machine, a nostalgia creator. Cassava pie, when I'm eating it, I think of family, granny, my brothers, my mom, and all of the years I've spent previously making it. So that's a really good question. And
Thank you for
cassava
sharing.
pie.
Thank you.
Good.
My name is Tyler. Question. My curiosity has gotten better instead of looking up online, and I just wanted to ask you some questions.
What does the B stand for? The B in my name